there were plenty of work experiences that I hated, but I knew I needed to do to just, get that experience. And I think there's room for that. Like, it's kind of eating your vegetables. You got to build those basics, do the hard workout. You're going to see the results. And at some point, you're going to get a chance to apply that in a way that it suddenly feels exciting.
Put that coffee down.
Creators are leaders. Be careful what kind of leaders you're producing here.
Helen, we're both in sales.
Let me tell you why I sucked as a salesman.
They realized that to be in power, you didn't need guns or money or even numbers. You just needed the will to do what the other guy wouldn't.
I'm not leaving. The show goes on.
Well, hello there, friend. Welcome back to the Construction Leadership Podcast. I am your host, Bradley Hartman, and on this show, we bring you ideas and insights from construction leaders across the country every single week to help you lead more effectively. This episode is brought to you by the Simple Sales Pipeline. If you have a sales team, business development, and you are looking to sell more in the future at higher profit margins, and you are not, with consistency and discipline, creating a forecast that goes into the future, you could even say it's a prediction of what you think is going to happen in the future, what can happen in the future, and you are not doing that every single month, you are flying blind into recessionary times. This is sales malpractice. This is leadership malpractice. You can solve this problem with a simple sales pipeline. No, you do not have to invest into a CRM that's going to cost you six figures and take 18 months to finally learn that your employees aren't going to put good information in it. You can solve this immediately in under 30 minutes per sales rep with the Simple Sales Pipeline. Learn more at thesimpleSalesPipeline.com. I'm excited to bring to you today my conversation with Miss Whitney Hill. She's the co-founder and head of business development at SnapADU. That's right, ADU. What is an ADU? An ADU stands for Accessory Dwelling Unit. Now, across the country and internationally, there are many different synonyms that are often used. We cover some of them to make sure you understand what the hell we're talking about here. Is we're talking about maybe a mother-in-law suite, a granny flat, maybe a casita. If you're Canadian, they call it a laneway suite. What this is a detached miniature single-family home behind another single-family home, generally in the backyard. Now, Miss Whitney Hill has as good a pedigree as anyone we've ever had on the show. She went to Yale University, got her undergrad in psychology. She went to NYU Stern School of Business, which is one of the best MBA programs on the planet. And then she started working for McMaster Carr. If you know McMaster Carr, they do industrial materials. So she got an understanding of kind of materials and building materials. Then she worked for Bain, so got some consulting chops. She then started a couple businesses on her own that eventually allowed her to team up with Mike Moore. Now, Mike Moore owned his own construction business, building single-family homes in San Diego, and they have combined to create SnapADU, a leader in the San Diego area. Whitney and I cover a lot of territory in this conversation. We talk about cycle time. We talk about construction processes. We talk about pricing. We also talk about their ability to have a competitive advantage in construction. We talk about why they make a lot of their insights and information publicly available and how they leverage transparency to better serve not only their customer, but also the industry. And of course, we talk about leadership principles and leadership styles. You, my friend, are in for a treat. You're going to learn a lot about ADUs in general, but also management and leadership ways to improve your own business. So without further ado, please enjoy my conversation with Miss Whitney Hill, co-founder and head of business development at SnapADU. As always, thank you for listening. Miss Whitney Hill, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Bradley. Excited to be here.
Yes, I'm thrilled you made time. I'd like us to start off a little bit at the beginning. I want you to rewind to place us in small Kansas town. You're 12 years old. You're about sixth grade. What does that version of Whitney Hill, what does she think she's going to be doing? Ballpark 2023.
That version of Whitney in Kansas had no idea, kept hoping that she would understand what she was supposed to be doing, didn't quite fit in rural Kansas, and didn't know yet. And I felt like that for decades, honestly. So I was one of those who figured it out along the way and just kept taking the next right step at the time until it all came together.
So tell me about this jump, which I can't imagine whatever rural town you grew up in, there was that many people that ended up in Yale. What was that transition like for you? How did that come about? How'd that get on your radar?
Yeah, I was a debate nerd in high school, so I got involved in that, and my coach realized that I had a lot of potential and encouraged me to think about applying to some very serious schools. And it wasn't typical for other students to do that. A lot of folks would stay in state. So I applied to all the big Ivies, got in. And, took the plunge, and kudos to my parents for supporting that the whole way. So there I was at, 18. I had not really spent a ton of time on the East Coast and plunged right in. So I think very quickly I felt like I'd finally found, the group of nerds like me, and I'd felt a bit like an outsider a lot of growing up. So it was nice to finally find that.
Well, I always say is folks who come into the construction industry in general that have a background in psychology studied the exact perfect topic there. What did you learn being kind of a fish out of water, being in a different cultural environment? I can only assume expectations were really high for a lot of folks, on campus at Yale. You're learning about psychology amongst people that are very different from you. What do you remember? Did you learn anything, kind of key principles about how people think and how they act and how they're different and how they're irrational and crazy sometimes? What did you learn there on campus about psychology that you still use today?
I think the biggest takeaway is how framing a decision can lead to vastly different outcomes. And so I actually ended up in psychology after dropping out of the economics track. That was too dry for me. I hated it. So I pivoted and studied social psychology, which is kind of the other side of economics, the behavioral side of it. So that part, what I dove into with all the research I did was around how can you get a different action based on whether you frame it as close or distant from someone's perspective. You could actually impact how much they would save for retirement if you made them feel close to a future self. You can also get different behaviors if you frame something as like a penalty versus a bonus. So all of that kind of interesting research is something that played into what I would do later too in my first job, where I was managing people right out of college.
Yeah. I feel like if I could go back in time, knowing what I know now, like behavioral economics would something I would totally nerd out to if I knew what I wanted to be now, right? Just with Amos Tversky and Danny Kahneman and Thaler, like all this stuff has come out, and everyone's like, our job as leaders is try to figure out how to shape behavior, and whether that's people we work with or, like in your case, maybe subcontractors, but also consumer behaviors and how people think about options. There's a whole wide world of things we don't know. And I think some very intuitive things that we do that lead to the exact opposite results of what we want. So that's fascinating. You then went to another fantastic school, NYU Stern School of Business, one of the best MBA programs in the country. You studied entrepreneurship. How impactful was that to learn about that circa 2007, 2010? And then again, you're fast forwarding another, almost decade to actually putting it to use. How influential was that?
Yeah, it was retroactively, it was quite influential. At the time, the entrepreneurship part almost felt like a jump, because I was actually doing my MBA part-time in the evenings and weekends while I was working full-time at the Master Car Supply Company. I was doing a management training program there where I was going to work in steel-toed boots. I worked some night shifts. I was managing people 2 or 3 times my age. It was one of the most trial by fire situations I've ever been in. And I'm a bit of an introvert. So like having to deal with people, managing them from like writing the reviews and all of those sort of difficult conversations, like all that was so important to do. And so back to your question about the MBA, all the classes that pertained to like processes and operations, all that was fantastic at the time, because I was able to go back to work the next day and try some things out. And then the entrepreneurship type classes felt aspirational. Back to your question about 12-year-old Whitney, I always had that bug, but I didn't know what to do with it. It felt like I didn't have a way to apply it. So even taking those classes, it was more of just like interesting thought exercise, kind of like you'd feel in undergrad when you didn't quite know what you were doing yet. Yeah. So at the time, I didn't know how helpful it would be. But now as I've like helped to grow SnapADU and this journey we're on, I'm realizing, oh, wow, I know what to do. I was trained for business here, because until you have somewhere to apply it, it doesn't really, I guess, hit you how much you do know.
Yeah. Now, looking at your background, I was curious how much of either the general direction or specific direction you knew you would take to where you are today, because McMaster Carr, I think of lots of heavy materials and building materials among them. Then you work at Bain, which is great, one of the best consultancies on the planet. And then you're at Roost and Rise, which is real estate investment. And then you're at Glendale Ridge Development, which sounds like a different form of real estate and housing. All of it in hindsight for me, I'm like, yes, all of these would just be fantastic learning grounds for SnapADU. Was there any point in there that you're like, yes, this is all leading there? Or is it at every step of the way, you're thinking how to do it great and you're looking for new opportunities and seeing what's next?
It was always the next right step, because again, I didn't have that vision of exactly what I wanted to do. So deciding to go to a supply company, it wasn't like I was passionate about industrial supply. I mean, I did have, probably a background that was more aligned with that than some people who like grew up in the city and never been around that, that kind of stuff. And I also am somebody who's just pretty no nonsense. I'll roll up my sleeves and do the work. Like sometimes you would literally be packing boxes, like not because you were supposed to be doing it, but just like kind of a fire drill situation. And all that felt very like natural. And so I think also just being able to communicate with folks on the front line, like driving forklifts or packing boxes, but also being able to communicate with an executive. I think coming from Kansas kind of gave me a unique way to be able to do that. But as far as how to pick where I was going, I just picked McMaster because it was an amazing opportunity and deal. They would pay for my entire MBA while I was working there, hands-on management experience right away, and general operational knowledge that I knew I wanted regardless of what I was doing. So it was all like, it was basically paid school, if I'm honest, even the job, because it was building my tools for whatever I was going to do. Same decision process really when I joined Bain. So I actually joined Bain in Denmark. My partner and I moved to Copenhagen for his job. And so I had to find work. And turns out consulting was my best option, because otherwise I was going to have to speak Danish and like all these things that just were a no-go. So luckily I was able to get a job there. But same thing, I knew that it would give me this general understanding. And I always was hoping that it would lead me to what I loved. And I kept thinking like, well, if I go through, a bunch of cases, I'm going to finally find an industry I'm passionate about. And again, that never really happened in that way. So over time, I transitioned out of Bain. I tried different models. They're very great with flexible work environments. And I had my 2 kids. So through all of that, I decided that, I wanted to do something that I was really excited about. And just in my personal life, I was excited about design and real estate and all that piece. I started listening to podcasts about it, thought I could do something on the side, but decided that I really needed to jump in with both feet if I was going to do it seriously. So after about 5 or 6 years at Bain then, so I've been probably in the workforce 10 or 12 years by then, I left to start something on my own. And the companies that you mentioned, Roost and Rise and then Glendale, were actually my own companies, and started out investing in different types of assets, small multifamily, then funding some fix and flips. And then finally having a fix and flip company, which is what Glendale was, where we were doing high-end renovation in commuter towns outside of New York City. So when I first made the plunge, I knew I was excited about real estate. There were lots of different aspects that I liked, and I wasn't really sure exactly where to start. So I kind of took a shotgun approach. Some things worked, some things didn't. But all of these things, like you said, eventually led to discovering ADUs, accessory dwelling units, as an asset class, and then just keeping my eye open for an opportunity, and finally focusing to really get good at one thing. And my whole journey up to that point, I was building generalist skills. I never wanted to specialize because I didn't know what I was excited about. Finally took that plunge to really focus, and that's where it's really blown up for me.
That's great. Yeah, I was giving some largely unsolicited advice to a friend and his son who's kind of getting ready to go out, leave college, and had no idea. And I was like, dude, do what you're interested in at that moment. Sample broadly, and on a long enough timeline, more than likely, something is going to really trigger and you're saying, I want to pour every ounce of myself into that. And when that comes across, jump on it. Until then, don't beat yourself up. Don't force it and just see what happens.
Yes, I can't echo that enough. And I should also say, like, there might be some experiences that you know are good for you that are not that pleasant. Like, there were plenty of work experiences that I hated, but I knew I needed to do to just, get that experience. And I think there's room for that. Like, it's kind of eating your vegetables. You got to build those basics, do the hard workout. Yeah. You're going to see the results. And at some point, you're going to get a chance to apply that in a way that it suddenly feels exciting. Like when I was doing, financial stuff, it's not my jam. When I'm doing that for someone else, it feels so onerous. But when I'm doing it for my own business now, it feels fun and engaging. So perspective will change over time. And I think you're totally right about just taking that next right step. You don't have to have the whole plan in place.
Yeah. I'm going to put a pin in Copenhagen. I'm going to circle back to that in a bit. I do want to jump in to ADUs here. Let's just start with, I'm sure you know more than I do. I know a couple. One of them I think you had mentioned. I'm like, oh yeah, that could be it. Let's run through some of the synonyms that would fall under the category of an ADU, an accessory dwelling unit. You guys in your website, I just find it a funny phrase. Granny flats is one. Okay, so we got that. What are some other synonyms that would fall into the category of what you guys do?
You might hear them called guest homes, guest houses, casitas, mother-in-law suite, laneway suites in some areas.
Laneway.
So all these, yeah.
Okay.
So they call them in Toronto. So they, depending on what region you're in, you might hear them term different things. And then it seems like over time, then as regulation catches up, you kind of catch on a single name. And ADUs have taken hold in California due to state level regulations.
Yeah. Well, all of this is built around, just having a conversation 24 hours ago with someone in the Pacific Northwest. We were just talking about the economy, what they're seeing, they're on the supply side, and affordability is such a known challenge. I would say beyond challenge, it's a risk. It's something that has to be addressed in the long term. I would say in the short term. Talk to me about where ADUs fit. And then I think for our audience here, I'm interested in knowing kind of on the construction, kind of cycle time and some of the nerding out on this stuff. And you guys have been really in the forefront, I think, of transparency. Like when I'm reading through and doing our research of what you guys are talking about, you're talking about pricing, you're talking about permitting, you're talking about site work, you're talking about construction, you're putting it all out there. So maybe this is what a bad podcast host does. They ramble on and they try to figure out the actual question to give the guest. Whitney, talk to me just about the affordability, how you guys view that, and how that ties in the transparency of everything you guys are doing.
Sure. Well, first, I wouldn't call it rambling. I would call it context. So thank you for that.
Thank you. That is very flexible. Thank you.
Well, I would say, first off, affordability is really relative. And anyone who's been looking at California real estate, especially in the more coastal areas like we serve down in greater San Diego, it's off the charts. The median home value is over $1 million now. So I think for those reasons, ADUs are particularly attractive here where the land cost is just so very high. So comparing building an ADU to acquiring another property, in that way, it's just a home run. And we see a lot of newlyweds or young couples, young adults who just can't afford the market. So they will build an ADU on their family's property. And the plan is, to be able to have that flexibility now. Maybe later they'll move out and it'll be rented by the family. So as far as affordability, it's really relative because on a per square foot basis, constructing ADUs is pretty darn expensive. Okay. And the obvious reason for that is that you're spreading those fixed costs over a much smaller footprint. So ADUs are typically between 400 and 1,200 square feet in California. Okay. And so you still, though, have a full kitchen, bath, all the same kind of a site work prep situation, plans, permitting. So then you're just spreading that over fewer square feet so your per square foot cost is $500 in a lot of cases. I mean, nuts numbers. So people will come asking for costs in terms of square footage prices that they're used to thinking about for a 2,000 or 3,000 square foot single family home. And it just doesn't translate. So in that sense, it doesn't seem affordable. And so for, different situations, it may or may not make sense. But as far as dealing with the housing crisis and coming up with other ways to fit more into the space that we have, a lot of it was zoned, pretty loosely with single family lots that are large. As far as, making it affordable from that perspective, yes. Construction cost per square foot, no.
Yeah. So, and maybe you can give myself and our audience kind of a frame of reference. You had, by the way, I will tell all our audience members, follow you guys on Instagram. The final product is gorgeous. I was stunned and I was like, why does this thing look like it's 3,000 square feet? It was 2-bedroom. I think maybe it's just 1 bath, maybe 2 bath, 750 square feet. And the photography was great. Everything, and obviously the finished home was great. It was furnished, but I was blown away. I'm like, it was gorgeous. So say that floor plan, you pick a spot somewhere in San Diego. I was in San Diego in October and I'm like, yes, if I had all the money in the world, I would love to live here because there's nothing not to like about it. But pick a general place. What's my ballpark all investment there if I wanted to get one of these and we wanted to put it in the backyard?
Yeah, let's pick, a 2-bedroom, 2-bath, like 1,000 square foot unit.
Okay.
For the build itself, you're going to be around $350,000 for the structure.
Okay.
Then you're also going to need to factor in site work, starting around $25,000 or so, typically, plus plans and permitting. So for a full set of plans and revisions, around $10,000 or $12,000, permitting about $10 a square foot. So what does all that add up to? You're going to be probably around low 400s for 1,000 square foot ADU in this market.
Got it. So family's got a house, they've been living there, and all of a sudden situation changes for my parents. We can get mother or father-in-law. We can now get them essentially in the backyard for what would be half of the median, not the average. Sometimes folks will get median and mean mixed up and they're like, well, you got some $50 million houses in San Diego. I'm like, no, that's median. Like, that's just the one in the middle. So it's not the average where it's getting dragged up. So they can get in there for less than half the cost, but still, obviously, a $400,000 house, obviously not inexpensive either.
Right, exactly. And then on the rent side, a lot of these are getting pretty close to like 1% rule where the rent will go close to 1% of that build cost, actually. So we're seeing even those 1,000 square foot units, like the one I just talked about, might be going for $3,500, $4,000, depending on where it's located. So for that perspective, some investors, it makes sense, especially if they have ways to finance it. Others, it doesn't pencil given their model. So it really is case by case.
Okay. You mentioned, as we were talking, was it laneway flats? Is that what it is?
I think maybe I'm butchering the term now, but yes, I saw them called that in the Northeast.
Don't let my questioning change you. You mentioned Toronto, though. I know you guys, everything is really kind of just locally and handling, and I think in some cases probably leading and guiding regulations here. Right now, as you kind of maybe look at 2023, is the current plan to really stick in and around San Diego, or are you guys doing this on a much larger footprint that may or may not include Toronto?
Current plan is to stay in Greater San Diego. We feel like there's a ton of runway here and also a lot of scale benefit to specializing. For example, things like the regulations, the more at-bats you get in a market, the more you're going to understand how it really gets interpreted in the field. The code may say one thing, but when it actually comes to building and having to have it inspected, you might get a very different result. So really only now, 3 years in, are we fully understanding all that, and that's becoming part of our sustainable advantage in this market. I would also say things like marketing, job site signs, having more jobs in a geography is already paying off, where more people are seeing our name, have heard of SnapADU. So we really want to build that presence here. And then lastly, as we all know, construction is a very local business in terms of labor and subcontracting. So we feel like at this time it would be starting a new business to have to do this in another market. So we feel like right now we want to just focus. And people, in some ways, I've seen folks trying to spread themselves too thin early and getting excited about like, oh yeah, let's take this national. Like, we really just don't want to do that. We want to be careful with our growth, make sure it's sustainable. And then lastly, like on a personal level, my business partner and I each have, a couple kids that are school age, and, we want to spend time with them right now. So it's a bit of a lifestyle thing where it's just not something we want to tackle at this moment.
Yeah. No, well, all those answers just lead me to say we're being really intentional, right? And maybe, yes, we've dreamed and we know that this potential version is out there if you go, and get a bunch of VC money, but you're going to be making trade-offs. And that's what that's all about. Is this all largely stick-built on site, or is there some off-site panelization going on? Maybe tell me a little bit about the construction itself.
Yes, ours is traditional stick-built construction.
Okay.
We've experimented with panel options and several times over the last few years in different configurations, but for us, it's still making most sense to just go stick-built. And so as far as cycle time, the all in from the time the client says, let's do this, to the time they're actually moving into the ADU, anywhere from 12 to 18 months. And it's that big of a window because of that middle segment. So design, permit, build. The permitting can take between 3 and 8 months, depending on what jurisdiction you're in, because there's such variability in how those departments are staffed and how they're processing plans right now. So design itself takes us about 3 months. And a lot of that is because we have a set of standard plans that we start with. We don't allow folks to just walk in with a napkin that's totally from scratch. We get them to start with our plans, mark them up. But that allows us to get to an approved design much more quickly. It also means that we're able to use all of our standards with dimensioning on doors and window size and that sort of thing that we've built in, so that we know that we can get the materials, that they're standard sizes, that we're not unnecessarily adding complexity. All these reasons we use standard plans as a base. Then we do handle permitting it in-house as well. But like I mentioned, it just varies so much city to city. Not only their processes and all that, which is fine. Some are digital, some are in person, and all that was a bit of a learning curve. But just how long they hold it, and also the differences in how they enforce things across the jurisdictions and even inspectors, is something that's very tricky. The biggest part of that, because we have to offer predictability for our clients who are trying to budget for this up front. Right. And if we don't know that they're going to trigger a $20,000 requirement for a drainage basin, we're going to lose that contract. So over time, back to your point about transparency, we built up a massive list of questions we know we need to answer in the first phases of this project, so that we aren't surprising people with giant change orders. And you learn that along the way. That's really the only way to do it. But by being fully integrated, so that build part is going to be taking us 4 to 6 months. We have the general contracting license. We have project managers and superintendents on our staff. We then subcontract out all the trades. But by having that full integration, we're constantly feeding back information that we need to include on the plans, that we need to know in our sales process, we need to put on the website. And our size with 16 employees means that we're small enough we can very quickly evolve our processes, but we're big enough that we're going to make it repeatable so that we can deliver the same experience for our clients. So overall, then that life cycle, what's that meant for our business? We've really only been able to see a fraction of what we have in the pipeline completed. So having such a long cycle time of, in a lot of these cases, 16 to 18 months in San Diego, where it's really backed up, it's meant that we're only just now getting to like version 2 or version 3 of how we run this. And a lot of folks, try to walk into this and nail it from the beginning, and you're just not. You got to be willing to iterate.
Yeah. As I was thinking about kind of your business and how you guys have been executing so well so far, question came up with transparency outside of kind of operational excellence of what you're talking about, getting these processes, just really communicating well. By the way, I'll say your website, for someone who's largely coming into this ADU conversation, barely literate, only a little bit knowledgeable, the educational content you guys have, here's 10 steps, and I'm going to give it to you in 400 words. If you want more, here's 10 steps in 10,000 words. The educational content there was fantastic. So hats off to you guys, because I think, as you're talking, from the inspectors to the consumers to anybody else in the construction community, yeah, we kind of know what it is. And that level of detail, I just think, help everybody get to be more knowledgeable, to speed this conversation. But are there things that you guys can do beyond operational excellence to build a moat around what you guys are doing as leaders in the ADU space, whether it's within California and San Diego or beyond?
Yeah. Well, first, thanks for the comments on the website. That's really been a huge part of our business. It's about 70% of our jobs come from people finding us on Google just through organic search. Okay. So it's been super important. And that was another big question, like how much information did we want to share? And historically, people don't share pricing. People don't share their secret juju. So It was kind of a big deal that we started just putting it all out there. I think back to, a podcast I listened to a few years ago said something like, if you tell somebody all your secrets, like, don't even worry, like nobody's going to execute on all of it. And it's so true, because the secret to like running a good business is not like having just the list of the tricks. It's actually going in, day out, and making that happen, knowing how to set it up, knowing how to integrate. And that's my answer to your question about how do we build this moat around the business? How do we have defensibility? It is actually in how many things we're getting right. Like our composite score is very high. There are other companies that might be crushing it on lead generation, or might be crushing it on just the design component component, but no one else is trying to do what we're doing. They're not integrated across design, permit, build. They're not trying to also be a leading source of information about ADUs. They're not trying to be a customer-centric construction company. They're not trying to have their permitting processes challenge some of the norms of how it's been done before. So I think just like the more skills that we're bringing under one roof, the more defensible this becomes, because to replicate it would just be a huge lift.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It's sometimes we'll work with clients and they're like, whatever happens, we can't let this out. And I'll generally say is, number one, your competitors are doing some version of this. And if they knew exactly what you were doing, at the end of the day, they still got to come in and got to do it. You got to do the hard work.
Yes.
And you got to love it. And it's not as easy as just knowing what that is. And actually, I just read a couple days ago, there was an article about that Coke's secret sauce that they've been like protecting for years. Like, it's out. Somebody has it. So they're like, at the end of the day, then what, right? And it has to be more than just that sauce to it. Maybe tell me a little bit about Mike Moore, because as you were talking there, you were saying, hey, we're thinking about, number one, the idea of a customer-centric construction company. For some people, they would say that's largely an oxymoron. That's really hard to do. Construction's hard. Humans are hard. But that's what we try to do every day. And I'm sure you coming from kind of an inside-outsider role, had some ideas on how do we do this differently? Because we've been building in America, especially stick-built construction for single-family homes, one way for a really long time. Maybe tell me a little bit about your collaboration with Mike Moore and kind of his existing construction business and how you're able to make something new and different.
Sure. So quick background on Mike Moore. He's the co-owner of SnapADU. And prior to us partnering up, he was running kind of a mom and pop style general contracting business that was, a decade in North County, San Diego. He was starting to try to specialize in ADUs. And meanwhile, I was just learning about ADU regulation. We got introduced through a connection. And from there, we realized that our skill sets really complemented each other. He'd grown up in construction, had grown up in small business, and I was coming at it from a very different angle as we talked about earlier. So your question about how do you get to this customer-centric construction company, when we built out the business, he already had a functioning construction company, right? So I was building out a lot of the front end of it, the sales and marketing, understanding the regulations, like all that part. And so the touch points with the clients there, also we had an amazing sales rep come on with a total veteran, almost more of a mentor to us, honestly, come on at the same time. So all that part was very customer centric. And then as it started hitting construction, I don't want to say the wheels would fall off, because when we were a small construction company, Mike did a really great job of managing the clients. He had great reviews. That was what really helped us kick off on the right foot with Snap, is that we had these awesome client reviews. But having a good customer experience at a small GC of maybe, 4 or 5 employees, where it's one person, one project manager for the whole thing. They're doing the proposal, they're doing the bids, they're doing all the client babysitting, all the warranty work, everything, right? One contact, and they really care and they get it. That's almost easy in a way to have a great client experience, because you're kind of just counting on one awesome person to deliver that. So as we started building Snap and getting more employees and having more parts to this process, disaggregating it, we weren't really focused on making sure it was a consistent client experience. We weren't explicit about who on our team was responsible for that client at the time. So in a way, we're doing some cleanup work to become truly a client-centric construction company. And we've got some of it right. Like we talked about transparency. We have locked pricing for them. We make the whole process very transparent, like we talked about. But now we're making sure we execute on the back end of that and sort of redesigning how we approach construction. And as far as, how did we, get to kind of that vision together, I think there's been different parts in the evolution where Mike's skills or my skills will come to the foreground as the ones that kind of lead the charge at that point in time. So we've also had to just be open to delaying decisions, right? Sometimes you don't have a right answer at that moment. And if you have to try to force it, maybe you need to think about putting it off. So we've also gotten good at just, tabling things when we're like, oh, this doesn't feel right, but we don't have an answer. Like we come back and revisit it. We've, worked through some stressful times when cash flow was tight because the pipeline was backed up, because permitting was taking twice as long. And you see a lot of different sides of your business partner, just like you would with a romantic partner, and you figure out how to navigate those dynamics. And I got to give Mike props. Like he's really great at stepping back, being self-aware when something, we have a conversation that isn't as positive. He's really great at owning his part of it, which makes me able to own mine too. And so you're kind of working on that business partnership just like you would any other relationship.
Yeah, that's well said. You had written, or I guess somebody interviewed you. I read a really good Q&A on Medium. Actually, I think the guy's last name was also Hartman with one N. So Jason Hartman?
You're right.
Okay. Anyway, I enjoyed reading that. It was really good research for us, but I enjoyed it. And you mentioned something that's really interesting, and maybe I can kind of frame this as a question. It seems like there's often this paradox in leadership, which is there are some uncomfortable, challenging decisions that we have to make, and we got to fight through adversity because it's the right thing to do, and we got to move forward. You were referring to something that I've had personal experience running our business recently, where it seems like it's something that's important that we have to do, and on a long enough timeline, we will absolutely have to address it. But it feels like we're forcing it. We don't have enough information. It just feels like we're fighting. And in some cases, it does take courage to say, we're not going to address this now. We're going to set it out over here. And we had this with our team, and we're like, I could see them like looking at the thing in the corner, be like, can we delay that? Any advice, general, specific, take it any way you want, on how to distinguish between some of these things that we feel like we have to force, things that we have to do, or things that maybe it's going to take some courage to set off to the side and, handle later.
Right. I think that it's helpful to set a time period when you're going to revisit it, because then it doesn't feel as angsty, like, oh, I'm ignoring this elephant in the room.
Yeah.
If you can set yourself a time frame that's maybe based on another action that's going to happen. For example, we know that our selections process right now, where clients pick their finished materials, is not a great part of our flow. Like it's kind of clunky. There's lots of things we could be fixing there. The exact answer is still not clear to us, but partly because there's other projects in flux. We're working on some 3D modeling software that's going to allow clients to see their floor plan in 3D and actually see the finishes and all that. So we've intentionally said we're going to live with this broken process until we have more input from that also very important project that will totally influence our decision there. So if you can delay it to a specific point in time when you have fresh information, that can also help it feel less like you're just ignoring it. Then it's more intentional, to use your word from earlier.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. Actually, that helps me think through what we're doing. And as you're saying that, I'm thinking of, a leader's responsibility has to illuminate the path. Where are we going and why? And if there are steps along that journey, and say, listen, we've got this, and this, we're going to prioritize these initiatives and we expect them to take these many months or years. You can also communicate this with customers and say, listen, this part of it, it's not going to be great. Here's what we do. And this is how we also ended up with, and we have great testimonials from these people who are on our website. So it's not that we don't know what we're doing. I'm also going to be upfront with you that, hey, we're going to have to kind of work through this in a little bit more of an analog version. So I think that's a great kind of first step of, as a leader, are we really articulating when we are going to go revisit that? So that's helpful for me.
Yes. And I want to build on what you just said, Bradley, about kind of owning those gaps and getting ahead of that with your clients. That was something that we weren't necessarily doing before. We would almost try not to interact because we didn't want to poke the bear and then have them ask other questions. And it's sort of like your point about transparency, where you know what, put the pricing out there. You know what, let's put our mistakes out there and tell the client that, to what to expect in this delay and why. Because at least then it looks like we know what's going on. We're building some credibility and trust. And you can get it right. But the more you're hiding information or just being opaque, it just raises more, honestly, that raises more questions than just putting the reality out there. So we're sort of shifting our mindset on that to kind of offer even more transparency to clients.
Yeah. And I think there's a way to do that where you say, hey, we're going to, 6 months from now, you and I are going to be working together. We're going to get to the stage and you're going to think, oh my gosh, guys, this is kind of a struggle and there's friction and you're not happy, but here's how we're going to get through this. If it's far enough away, you've already planted a seed. What often happens, they are planning for the worst case scenario. And they get there and they're like, is this what you're talking about? I mean, remember you mentioned there's going to be this friction part of the process. Are we here now? And you just say, actually, we just left that. We're done with that. And they're like, oh, yeah, that wasn't that bad. Like you oversold, some of your flaws. Right. And now all of a sudden, like, no, it's fine. And so I think there's multiple ways you can do that. Now, if it's like, hey, you're going to hate me for this and it's going to be tomorrow, you might freak them out and they're going to not sleep that night. But if it's far enough in advance, that's a tactic that works well too.
Absolutely. Under promising in effect.
Yeah. So I'm watching the time here. I want to make sure we hit on kind of leadership And how might you describe kind of your leadership style? And is that similar or different than Mike's background, knowing that you guys are two leaders coming from different perspectives that have different skills and attributes to offer SnapADU?
Our leadership styles are extremely different. And as soon as you started asking about leadership, I was already thinking about that. I was like, oh, this would be a great example because Mike and I are total opposites. My style is very collaborative. It's, in consulting, Bain is consistently one of the top places to work. That's for a reason, right? There's a huge focus on development and nurturing leadership in all forms, making sure that everyone feels heard, pretty flat hierarchy in some ways. So that's kind of where I grew up. And also just, people trained in management styles where it's very specific with performance reviews and, it's actionable, blah, blah, blah. With Mike, right, he grew up in construction. It's gritty. It's more direct. It might even be a little bit of a dictator style in some places, like get it done or else, right? We've all had seen subcontractors that work that way. So there's definitely more of that bent in Mike, but balanced with the self-awareness. So that actually makes for some really great interactions where Mike is open to feedback as we're growing, where he'll come to me and say, hey, I haven't had to deal with this kind of a situation with a bigger team. How would you handle this? So we've been able to kind of rely on each other's strengths. Then on the flip side, his negotiation chops are just really advanced because he's had to deal with a lot of these small business challenges for a lot longer than I have. I was in small and medium-sized companies. I wasn't dealing with some of the same challenges that you see as a general contractor. So in that way, I've learned a lot from him on stylistic type things in customer situations or negotiating with cities, that sort of thing. So, but this is one of the maybe biggest flashpoints because you can have such different perspectives on how to handle something. And it might take a while to get aligned on, well, what's our vision for Snap? We're going to take what we like of my approach and of your approach and come up with kind of a best of breed sort of a thing. But as your company evolves too, it's going to be different times for those different styles to shine. And we've really tried to lean into taking advantage of what we each can bring to the table.
Yeah. Yeah. Somebody mentioned, I was talking about our growing pains and they're like, listen, man, when you go from 1 to 3 and then 3 to 6, 6 to 12, he's like, these are different companies. They're different things. It's not just an evolution. They are completely different. And I often think about that. And I think about kind of your team as you're growing at the speed at which you're growing. You're like to your point, those are just different things that are going to require different things at different times. Before I go, I want to make sure I ask you this. You guys are 70%, including your independent contractors and interns. Good for you guys hiring interns. 70% female and minority. If we have people that are listening that are saying, I look around my construction team and you know what I see a lot of? I see a lot of middle-aged white dudes. How might they be able to take one small step to think differently, to do something differently, to get more talent? Because I see people like you, you're smart, you're young, you're female, you're like, this is only going to help us be better thinkers because we have a diversity of thoughts and experiences. What's one thing maybe you could recommend that maybe you see other companies aren't doing? Maybe it's obvious, maybe it's non-obvious. Any ideas come to mind?
Yes. We didn't set out to just hire a bunch of women and minorities. That's not why we're here. It's because we were more flexible in our approach to who was going to fill the role. We didn't take a just check the box approach on your experience. We didn't say that they had to have had exactly this kind of a role before. So we've taken all these folks who were they were kind of underappreciated. They were being underleveraged in their last company. They weren't given those opportunities. And so I think by being open to that profile, it just naturally was in underrepresented groups and women. So my suggestion would be to be more flexible in the talent pool, not even the talent pool, forget the people, the qualifications that you're looking for. Think about how things from different industries could translate. Great example for you. 2 of our project managers had backgrounds in set construction, for theater. So they were project managing 20 different, designs and builds a year, but not for houses, right? It was for construction of a set. But there's so much overlap in what they did with what we do. But the pay rate and everything in that kind of a sector, they were actually at a university. It was night and day. Yeah. So you're able to find some incredible value too, where it's an amazing opportunity for the employee. You're getting somebody that in a way is is like out of the league of what you could otherwise afford. Like it's a win all the way around. You're also taking somebody and giving them room to grow. So I think also looking for people who are versatile has led us to perhaps overhire for women and underrepresented groups, because we're not just, again, looking for a cookie cutter mold, which tends to be white guys.
Yeah. No, it's a great piece of advice, because we'll often look through some qualifications and they'll say, listen, it's construction, you're putting one thing on top of the other, and we got some fasteners and we put all together. And like, we can teach you that. We can teach anybody how to build. You say, okay, great. What are the qualifications? I need a 4-year degree. I'd be ideal if you had a PE. You have gone through, get a construction management degree, and you have to have, worked in the business for 4 years. I was like, you just said you could teach anybody how to build.
Right.
It doesn't appear you're actually following through. So I think that's a good point. And sometimes, especially we have a lot of listeners that they're working in organizations, whether they're publicly or privately held, that have been around for a century. Sometimes what made you successful and the recipe for that's just kind of a given. And someone has to raise their hand and say, could we revisit some of these things? And is it possible we made some small changes and we truly believe we're good at educating and developing and training new talent? Maybe we change that, and would something else happen? And I think the answer is, yeah, it might. There's no guarantees, but it might.
Yes. And I think, like you said, it will evolve too with where you're at in your growth. Like, we've learned we need to hire more experienced people right now. Just general work experience, maybe a decade or something under their belt. So we're not having to train somebody on the basics. We made that mistake with the first round of hiring that we did. People were too green. And not only were we having to teach them how to build a building, like you just said, which is fine, but having to teach them like all the basics of how to operate in a work environment was just too much. So I think knowing where you're at in your life cycle of like being able to support employees and what type you can accommodate at that time is super important as well.
That's awesome. Well, I've got a whole other host of questions, but in the interest of time, I just want to say thank you. I'm excited for what you guys are doing. And again, I just think as you get enough smart people coming at this affordability issue from different angles on a long enough timeline, we are going to be able to make progress on what is a known recurring issue for a long time. So before we go, I want to make sure we make it abundantly clear, where can people learn more about SnapADU? Where can they learn about you? If people are interested in reaching out and connecting, like, go and be real direct on how they can take those next steps after listening to this.
Sure. Check us out on SnapADU.com. And if you want to get in touch with me personally to talk about business or construction or anything, email me. It's Whitney@SnapADU.com. I will take the hidden spam if I get it, but love to have chats with all sorts of people.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much. Congratulations on all your success. Excited to see what you guys do next. And thank you.
Thanks so much, Bradley. Great to be here. Thanks for the time.
All right, friends, how did that go? Hopefully you enjoyed my conversation with Miss Whitney Hill. I don't know exactly how this is going to play out in the future. Obviously, there's a lot of red tape and regulation in California and certainly in other parts of the country. But as we figure out how to address this issue of affordability, which has to be solved on a long enough timeline, ADUs and smart people like Whitney and Mike Moore and their team are really going to help us lead us to a better future. I believe that. If you did get value from this episode with Miss Whitney Hill, please rate and review this podcast. That means more to us than you know. This episode was brought to you by the SimpleSalesPipeline.com. Again, if you are not building out your pipeline and forecasting consistently to understand how you need to change behaviors and change tactics in the sales environment as we head into 2023 and beyond, you, my friend, are flying blind, and you don't need to invest in a giant, expensive CRM that people aren't going to use. You can solve it immediately in under 30 minutes by checking out the SimpleSalesPipeline.com. As always, we want this to be the best podcast you listen to. So if you have suggestions to improve the show, maybe different topics, maybe different guests, anything you want to hear, or if you have something you would like to quote unquote ask for a friend, we specialize in taking these questions and answering them for you in the form of a podcast and or newsletter. So do not hesitate to reach out to me directly at Bradley@BradleyHartman, 2 N's, and co.com. And since I mentioned our newsletter, if you are not subscribed to our construction leadership newsletter that I bust my tail to write twice every single month to be worth your time and attention, you should absolutely do that. You can either email me directly. I will add you personally. Well, actually, I won't. Some very valued member of my team will. Or you can go to our website, bradleyhartmanandco.com, scroll down to the bottom of any page, type in your information, and you're going to get it. It's every other week. And I love doing it, really put our best writing out there. And in the event that you find that we ever failed to do that, you can unsubscribe with one click. However, you can be sure that I will do my best to make sure that never happens. I value your time and attention, which brings us to this point. I should just quit talking. You, my friend, you are owed nothing. Deliver value first. Make it a great week.